Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan Anderson. I'm one of the founders of Telos U. This webinar will talk about family roles, rules, and dynamics. Now, sometimes when we talk about these, people discuss with us the fact they're feeling a little bit confused that we put so much emphasis on family dynamics and functioning in our program. There's a lot of reasons behind this. And you'll hear me say this several times, but one of the reasons behind this is because one of the most powerful things you can do to support your young adult child in growing, developing, overcoming their challenges is to evaluate and continue to evolve your own family dynamics. This also goes a long way towards helping parents feel better. We recognize that a lot of times with our students, there's been a lot of complications in the past. And a lot of times, families are locked into survival mode. And understanding how to get out of survival mode and move forward is a part of everyone healing and getting better. So, this is one of the reasons this is such an important topic while you're here at Telos U. So, let's dive in and make sure we understand we're talking about the same things. When we talk about the idea of roles, kind of a more clinical definition of roles is this quote, family roles are the recurrent patterns of behavior by which individuals fulfill family functions and needs, unquote. Or the way that the APA defines it is, quote, a coherent set of behaviors expected of an individual in a specific position within a group or social setting, unquote. So, in other words, a role is a specific set of ideas, attitudes, behaviors, functions, and identities that someone is given within a system. And it's not just how they define themselves, but it's how other people define them as well. For example, you might have the golden child and the problem child. You might have the smart one. You might have the athletic one. You might have the problem solver or the peacemaker. And so, coming along with each one of these roles is a set of behaviors, attitudes, and patterns that are displayed by the person and that other people expect that person to display. In fact, sometimes families will respond with distress or negative feedback if the person is not displaying those particular patterns. And the function of these attitudes, behaviors, and patterns is that it's serving some kind of a purpose, some kind of a function, some kind of a role in the system itself, and that these different roles that people have play off of each other in a variety of ways. So, one thing to keep in mind is almost everyone you can think of has a wide variety of roles. They can have different roles within the same system. So, for example, in a family, you might be the one who's bringing in an income. You might also be seen as the active parent or the distant parent. You might be seen as the decision maker or the authoritarian or as the pushover. There's lots of different roles that you might have within that one system of the family. But also, people tend to have multiple roles across different systems. As you'll notice in this illustration here, this person is wearing a number of different roles like coach, friend, lawyer, soccer mom, consumer, wife, neighbor, and so all of these roles are a part of our way of interacting with our larger world. And these roles can combine, sometimes in ways that are harmonious. So, for example, in a happy marriage, both being a wife and a mother tend to build on each other. In a stressed marriage, being a wife and a mother, or a father and a husband, tend to have points of conflict with each other. Or sometimes you'll feel that conflict between your role in your work and your role as a spouse or your role as a parent or other things along those lines. So there are many ways in which the different roles that we all take upon ourselves or have put upon us combine, sometimes in helpful ways, sometimes in ways that cause problems and struggles. It's also important to recognize that our role or our combination of roles is not the same as our identity. Our identity, our personality, is something separate from that altogether. Now, roles are a social interface. They're a way of positioning oneself in relation to other people. And the problem is that sometimes we begin to think that our roles are our identity, or that other people's roles are their identity. And if you're looking at people's roles as their identity, inevitably you're being two dimensional in the way that you think about them. And it's not an actual full representation. And sometimes within families, people can get locked within roles and lose track of themselves or lose track of each other. Another thing to keep in mind is that roles do change over time. For example, we all start off as infants and we might serve some certain emotional roles within the family, but that's pretty much it. As we go through life, the roles that are reasonable for us to fulfill, that we can fulfill, expand and change and evolve. The tricky thing is that sometimes systems can keep people stuck in old roles that no longer work for them. For example, we work with young adult children here at Telos. Sometimes family roles and dynamics work in a way that still continue to define that young adult child as a much younger child, a much less capable person, someone who can't be asked to do certain things because it's technically more than they can handle. That's the way that they're defined. But that definition, that role is no longer adaptive or even necessarily accurate as a description of the person, of what they're capable of, and what they need to be able to do. So, one of the things we're always on the lookout for is the role this person is in, does it suit their current capacity, their current needs, their current potential? Is it asking too much? Is it too limiting? These are all things that we'll be thinking about as we help you examine your family roles. One thing to keep in mind is that there's no such thing as just one role that's assigned to someone and everyone just agrees with it. Different family members may identify other individuals in different roles. Ask yourself, who's the smartest person in the family? Well, more than likely, there will be a couple different answers to that. But also, especially like in families where there's conflict between parents or where there has been a divorce, sometimes there's this competition. Who is the one who's seen as the good parent versus who is the one who's seen as the bad parent? Interestingly enough, there doesn't have to be a good parent and a bad parent. There's a lot of emotional reasons why we kind of create that dichotomy and try to define ourselves or the other parent in that way. And so this can lead to really complicated family dynamics in which an individual may try to create alliances with other family members to agree with them on who gets defined as what, who gets put in what roles. And this can be a form of conflict and even sort of open warfare in families. And this is something we'd be looking at. Again, particularly, this is something for us to look at in families where divorce has been a part of the family experience. Now, roles serve a variety of different functions, and in fact, can serve more than one function. And sometimes they're serving those functions at all times. Sometimes those functions are context specific. A couple of examples of these functions: the role may be designed to protect a certain dynamic or belief about an individual, about the family, about the world. But it may also, on the other hand, be there to challenge a certain dynamic or belief. So, for example, the golden child often serves the role of protecting the idea that the parents are good parents, whereas the rebellious child, quote unquote, serves the role of challenging the idea that the parents are perfect and trying to expose areas in which they need to continue to grow. Certain roles may reduce anxiety. For example, the overly functioning, highly responsible child that might be compensating for a parent who is neglecting their responsibilities within the family. Their job is to reduce the anxiety of the family of not having those needs met by the parent and to reduce the anxiety of the parent about them not fulfilling those particular pieces of their responsibilities. Roles may hide uncomfortable truths and give alternative explanations, or roles may expose uncomfortable truths. They may be to project a certain image, maybe the image that the family is perfect, or that the family is broken, or that someone has a certain attitude or attribute that maybe they do or don't have. Sometimes roles are designed to simplify, a little bit like stereotypes, where we rely on stereotypes because it makes it easier to think about things, but in the same way, it makes it less accurate for us to think about things. Roles can be to stabilize, to take difficult pieces that are causing strain and to reduce the strain so that the relationships continue. They may be there to create predictability or to control or set limits or to create a trajectory, some kind of direction for individuals within the family or families as a whole. For example, one of the roles of parents is to create a trajectory for their children of being able to take care of themselves emotionally and physically, and to be able to create relationships with other people outside of the family. So that's an example of a trajectory that the role of parents might set. Now, when we think about each of these functions, almost every role has the possibility to play itself out in ways that are positive or in ways that might be negative or maladaptive. Now, there are a few exceptions. For example, the role of abuser or tyrant cannot play out positively. The role of addict does not play out positively within a family. Now, it may have a lot of other things that people do to try to compensate for that that are positive attributes within themselves. But one thing to keep in mind is there are certain roles that, if they do exist within a family, are destructive and would need to be addressed and hopefully resolved. Here's a number of other roles that people might play, anywhere from the family hero to the switchboard in charge of communication between family members to the one that we blame for everything. This is often referred to as the scapegoat, the black sheep, or sometimes we call them the identified patient. They're the one who has the problems. And in so doing, they kind of hide any problems that anyone else might have, or the cheerleader, or the truth teller. There's so many different examples. In fact, the number of roles is really rather large, but these are just a couple of common ones that we tend to see. And as you take a look at this list, and as you think about yourself and your family members, I encourage you to begin thinking about which of these roles you might see active in your family and where those might be. Now, let's talk about family rules. Now, of course, there's overt family rules. That's not really what we're going to spend most of our time talking about. These overt rules are pretty easy to understand. There's some sort of limit or boundary or guideline that has been set within a family. Things like be home by 11 o'clock, do your homework before playing with your friends, or if you want to go out, the parents need to know where you're going, who you're going to be with while you're there, and what you're going to be doing. And those can be powerful guides and shapers of behavior, but it is the covert, implicit, unspoken rules that are much more powerful in the impact they have on individuals and families. Now, these unspoken rules oftentimes can be explicitly understood, but just not actively spoken about most of the time. So, for example, one family I'm aware of, there's kind of this rule that the kids all know. The idea is that if you want something, make sure to ask dad for it, but wait until he's had an argument with mom, because dad tends to think that mom is too strict. So if they've had an argument, he's going to be angry at her and will be much more likely to give you whatever you ask for because he's feeling frustrated with her. Uh, so this might make you think about other examples of rules like this you might have known either in your own family growing up or that might exist in your family right now. Now, sometimes we're actually not consciously aware of these implicit, unspoken rules, but we feel them kind of under the surface, and we either obey or resist them. And if you were to put them into words, they might sound like this: whoever admits that they were wrong loses. When something bad happens, someone must always be blamed. We never talk about dad's drinking, ever. We must always act as if mom is right, especially when she's wrong. Never do anything that would make people think our family has problems. If two people have different opinions, one of them must be wrong. And things like mental health issues are character flaws. These are powerful beliefs that guide the way people think, feel, and interact within a family. Now, as I'm talking about these, I'm making it sound perhaps like all of these are negative. These implicit family rules can also be very positive and healthy. Things like every member of this family is worthy of love. Effort is a reasonable expectation, perfection is not. You can never be stronger than when you can admit that you are wrong. It's okay to admit that you need help. Mistakes aren't the end. We can always try again. Love people, not things. Use things, not people. We can do hard things, and everyone needs a break sometime. So, if you think about your family, a lot of these implicit rules are things that you find yourself obeying, teaching, enforcing, encouraging in other people. Now, family rules come from a lot of different places. They can come from family history and experiences. They can be passed down from one generation to the other until they just feel like they're self evident truths and just simply the way the world is. So they're often multi generational. They can come from our individual cultures, from values that we've cultivated or have been handed down to us. And also, quite frequently, family rules have their origin in pain and trauma, things that people have suffered, and ways that they have set things up in their lives to try to avoid further suffering. And as such, sometimes that's adaptive, and sometimes it's actually overly restrictive. Sometimes it's limiting. Sometimes it's running from a monster that no longer exists. So, one of the things that we're going to be asking you to do is to think about your family of origin and your current family and to try to identify potentially constraining implicit rules. There's a number of questions you can ask yourself to try to identify what they might be. For example, what emotions are unacceptable? What topics are off limits? What are the gender roles? And how firm are they? What happens if someone steps outside of them? What thoughts and feelings tend to get ignored, denied, or invalidated? How are mistakes viewed? Is it the same for each family member, or are there different standards for different family members making mistakes? What expectations are placed on people? Are there double standards anywhere in the family? Are there contradictions within the family? What kinds of situations cause stress or tension? What is considered valuable and good? And what is considered dirty or bad? Now, we're going to move on to talk about family dynamics. When you have these rules and roles, you can see that they kind of tend to move towards action. They impel us towards doing or not doing certain things. And that's the whole idea about a dynamic. A dynamic is the action of a system, the interaction between the different family members. And all of these become something that functions as a larger system that is actually greater than the sum of its parts. And it's very much these family dynamics are influenced by the roles and the family rules. And there are major factors that are a part of family dynamics. There's this family structure that includes things like boundaries. For example, do two parents have good boundaries around talking about adult level things with each other and then filtering their communication to the children in something that's developmentally appropriate? Or are the two parents in a position where they don't have a filter there and children are brought into things that would be more appropriate between the parents or are treated with information that's above what they're developmentally ready for? So there are boundaries and there are different subsystems and there are ways that all of these interact. There's patterns of interaction, both positive and negative. There's the way the system works together to make meaning out of things that are going on within the family, in individuals, in the world. And of course, there's the way the family interacts with larger systems. So when we think about a family as a system, there's a couple basics to understanding systems. First of all, systems have feedback loops. that create and maintain a homeostasis. So, for example, we find our level of survival and functioning. And if anything pushes too far above or too far below that, there are usually forces within the family that work to try to bring things back into the center. Now, that can be true when the center is something that is healthy and is working for the family, but that is also true when the center is something that is unhealthy and that isn't working. Systems resist change, and feedback loops are a part of that resistance to change. Another thing is that there's circular causation. So we recognize that it's not the children just cause the parents' behavior, the parents cause the children's behavior. There's a back and forth, there's a mutual causation of thoughts, feelings, interactions. And so that's actually really powerful for us to learn is as we're trying to help your young adult child grow, we have to be thoughtful about their interactions with you and vice versa, because that absolutely plays into whether their growth will occur or not. Now, dynamics can change in reaction to symptoms in an individual. So, for example, if someone develops cancer or someone develops depression, that will have an impact on family dynamics. And again, causation goes the other way as well. Dynamics can and do contribute to or even cause symptoms in an individual. So, for example, we can see that high degrees of parental conflict can and do create anxiety, even long lasting anxiety, and even trauma in children. And then, as the children are responding with that anxiety and trauma, that oftentimes leads to the parents having greater conflict, especially with one parent trying to blame the other for being the cause of the child's symptoms. So, oftentimes, what this happens is that someone in the family kind of gets tagged with the identity of the identified patient. This is the person who has problems, and all of the problems within the system are kind of being given to that person as their responsibility. However, as we've really researched mental health issues, we begin to realize that's not a helpful way of understanding things. Everything exists within context, both in the way that that person says their depression impacts the system, the rest of the system, but also with the way the rest of the system impacts the depression. So, also, sometimes the symptoms are misleading. Sometimes we have to take a look at what the symptoms are and what role they play within the system. And we have to help the system learn to fulfill that function better in order to free the person up, in order to get better. So this can be sometimes counterintuitive in the way people think about things, saying, hey, look, if this person got over their depression, what problems would it cause within the system? What changes would it require? And what inside of the system might resist or struggle with those changes. Now, let's talk a little bit more about structure. When we're talking about structure, we're talking about the position of various members of the family and the boundaries that connect them. Sometimes people have very loose boundaries within each other. So, what I'm thinking and feeling gets essentially eclipsed by what someone else is thinking and feeling. This is really easy to do, especially, say, when a child has anxiety. We see this all the time where a child is struggling with something, say they're having trouble at school and they get anxious about it. And if a parent is having difficulty with their interpersonal boundaries with the child's anxiety can get downloaded into the parent. And that can lead a parent to doing something like making the child's struggles now the teacher's problem to solve, rather than working with the child to see how they can solve it and work on it together. So when there's that kind of blending together and very loose interpersonal boundaries between members of a family, we call that enmeshment. When family members are capable of caring about each other, but also having their own thoughts and feelings and not having the other person's downloaded into them, we call that differentiation. And differentiation is an important part of healthy family structure. There's also various subsystems. One of the most important subsystems in the family is the parental subsystem. The health and functioning of the parental subsystem has an enormous impact on the entire rest of the system. This is one of the reasons that we have our parenting evaluations and we teach parenting tools and we work with co-parenting or parallel parenting, even when there have been divorces, because this is an important part of the functioning of the system that promotes the health of all of the members of the system. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that there's some structure forms that are very much adaptive, but some can be problematic. So an example of a problematic structure would be parentification. What that looks like is when, say, there's a weak relationship between the two parents. And so one of the parents may essentially promote one of the children into the parental role and use them as a sort of a substitute parent. This is both ineffective parenting, but also puts a tremendous amount of emotional and psychological strain on the child. And although the child may seem to be very high functioning, this usually leads to profound anxiety and depression. Or on the other hand, there can be infantilization, the idea that a child is treated perpetually as if they are too young, too fragile, too incapable to take on the responsibilities of their age and developmental stage. So sometimes we have to take a look and say, these structures aren't working. They're a part of why the symptoms, the mental health symptoms, exist. And if we want to help resolve the mental health symptoms, we have to help create a structure that is more conducive for health here. Now, there is one set of dynamics and structure that is so destructive that it deserves its own attention. And it's something that's called triangulation. So, in triangulation, there are two members of a family who are in conflict with each other. So, as you see these two diagrams, we have the circle is the mother, the square is the father on the top. And the red dotted line between them shows that there is conflict between them. And rather than finding a way to resolve that conflict, you'll notice there are two different forms of triangulation that are shown here. On the one on the top right, the child, the square below, is distant from the father. You can see that by the small dots between him and the father. But he and his mother develop a strong alliance together, and it's an alliance against the father. So there's a lot of time and energy that goes on between them. But the problem is, it doesn't do anything to resolve the distance between the child and the father or the conflict between the mother and the father. As such, it tends to just amplify and exacerbate the problems. Or the second one is where you see the mother and father have a conflict with each other and they both try to form an alliance with the same child. There's a whole lot of science behind triangulation. People do this because they're trying to deal with tension, but rather than finding some way to resolve it with the person that they're having tension with, they bring in a third party to have some kind of an alliance with. This is profoundly destructive to the mental health of the person being triangulated. And it is also extremely disruptive to any kind of healthy functioning within a family or any kind of system in which it works. So, one of the things that we're going to be working on is helping you identify where triangulation may be occurring in your family. It may pop up in your communication with us in family therapy sessions all over the place. And when and where it does, we will be helping you identify it and learn to address those concerns in a way that doesn't involve triangulation, because the continuation of triangulation is one of the biggest mistakes, one of the largest contributors to ongoing mental health problems. Also, something can happen within a system called functional symptomatic behavior, where one person in the system is acting up and seems to be the problem, but is actually masking another problem within the system. A classic example would be a family where there are parents that have two children, and the parents are in an argumentative relationship with each other. These arguments are tremendous causes of stress for the children. It upsets their sense of safety and predictability and their attachment to their parents. So, what was seen in this classic example is that the older child, anytime the parents would get into arguments, would do something to make the younger child cry. And the function that that serves is that the parent would stop arguing to attend to the younger child and to scold the older child. So even though the older child was getting into trouble and was being seen as the problem child and causing all kinds of problems for him, that behavior disrupted what was the more disruptive behavior for him. This wasn't something he was doing purposefully, going, wah ha ha, I will pinch my sister and therefore my parents will stop fighting. It was something that just evolved and it worked. And so it became reinforced over time. So this is the sort of thing we're constantly looking for is the symptom that we're identifying, is it just about the symptom? Or is there some other dynamic going on inside the family system that leads to this symptom that we need to help identify and address if we want to resolve the symptom in question? And oftentimes there are paradoxes that can happen in a family where they are trying to solve problems, but the solution that they have adopted actually becomes the new problem. In fact, the larger problem, a lot of times it can be a little bit like having a grease fire on the stove. And the way you're trying to solve it is by throwing water on it. Hopefully, you know that if you throw water onto a grease fire, it makes it explode. So, a lot of times, family dynamics that aren't working well are an effort to solve some kind of problem, to solve the grease fire. But family members are frequently unaware that their attempt at solving the problem is actually making it worse. They're not aware that throwing the water on the fire is the thing that is exacerbating the problem so much. Now, here's a couple examples of this. For example, think about parents who have different points of view of how to parent the children. And the way they try to solve that is just to stop talking to each other about parenting issues. And this one parents the way they want, and that one parents the way they want. Seems like a solution, but it actually creates a much larger problem. Or think about families avoiding discussions of difficult topics. Yes, it evolved in such a way where it's avoiding immediate anxiety, but it's causing anxiety and problems to build up. Think of giving a child what they want in response to them acting in a hostile or dangerous way. Yes, it may settle them down right now, but it's also taught them that acting in a hostile or dangerous way is an adaptive way to behave because it gets them what they want. Or think about trying to use consequences on a child who is neglecting their responsibilities as a result of anxiety or depression. Consequences don't resolve anxiety or depression. And in fact, they tend to build up over time and make the anxiety or depression worse. Also, let's think a little bit more about the idea of circular causation. Oftentimes, maladaptive dynamics can be passed down from previous generations and tend to repeat themselves over and over again, sometimes without us even realizing it. So, one thing to keep in mind is that mental health challenges can be the result of these maladaptive dynamics that have been passed down for generations. And, the family has developed kind of a survival mode. But these in turn lead to the family members staying stuck. So our mental health challenges feed maladaptive family rules and dynamics. And then maladaptive family rules and dynamics feed mental health challenges in return. And it's very easy to get stuck in that loop. And that's one of the reasons why evaluating the rules, and dynamics is essential in healing for anyone who's struggling with any kind of mental health issues. Now, the good news is that as you begin to develop your awareness of your family dynamics, roles, and rules, and as you work on actively evolving them, this is a very powerful tool in helping things get better. So it can be sticky. It involves evaluating things that have always just been. It involves questioning things that have been just subconscious. It involves creating a certain degree of vulnerability around yourself, your own roles, your own position, your own family dynamics. But the willingness to do so is one of the most powerful things you can do to promote your child's health and healing. And in so doing, to promote your own health and healing. So, what can you expect as we work on this in family therapy? Well, there are several questions we're going to explore with you. First of all, we want to explore what are your family's roles, rules, and dynamics. And we're going to want to take a look at your family history and see what important contributing events have occurred. And we want to help you look at the repetitive patterns that occur when a family member or family members are stuck. We want to take a look at these roles, rules, and dynamics and ask ourselves, well, how do they make sense? There's a reason they became what they are. And what about them is working? And what about them seems to be the result of crisis? What about them is not working? And how can we help you restructure them in a way that fits your family's needs better? This can be an emotionally taxing thing to dive into looking at your own family dynamic. But I will say again, not only is it the most important thing you can do to promote your child's healing, this process can and will be, if you embrace it, a process of healing and liberation and empowerment for you as well.